Welcome to week 12 of Human Information Behavior. This is Elaine Kaufmann. I'm going to be covering Personal Information Management, also known as PIM, in my presentation. I'd like to give a brief overview of what I'm going to discuss. First, I will talk about what PIM is. What does Personal Information Management mean? I'm also going to talk about how changes in technology have affected our PIM behaviors. Finally, I will discuss the issue of metaphor in conjunction with PIM and how language choice plays a role in how we understand PIM activities. In one of this week's readings, Personal Information Management, William Jones defines PIM as the management of external forms of information by an individual. Jones gives a long list of activities that fall under the heading of PIM: creating, collecting, storing, finding, using information, for example. He then classifies these activities under three main headings. First is finding activities. This has to do with locating information that will satisfy a need. Next is keeping activities. This has to do with where and how we store information. And finally is meta-level activities, which has to do with how we keep everything organized. These PIM activities are relevant for tasks that we undertake in many different roles. We may use them as an employee, but also as a parent or a friend. I know it is very relevant to my current role as a student. PIM can refer to managing the digital information that we use, whether in the form of email, computerized calendars, Word documents, internet bookmarks, or digital images. But it's important to note that PIM is not limited to digital information. Post-it notes, sketches, a handwritten list, a phone number written down on a magazine page, these also can be pieces of information that need to be dealt with. To discuss some of the challenges of personal information management, I'm going to focus next on a couple of articles that I read outside of the readings for the week. The first is by Michael Bernstein and is called Information Scraps: How and Why Information Eludes Our Personal Information Management Tools. Bernstein defines information scraps as personal information held outside of its natural home. By definition, information scraps are in the wrong place. Information scraps can take many forms and includes both digital and physical scraps. A few examples include a note taped to the wall, a snapshot on a camera phone, a calendar entry that doesn't refer to an event. Here are some images taken from Bernstein's article. If your workspace looks anything like mine, you can probably see many more examples of information scraps around you. With information appearing in so many different forms and locations, we may have difficulty finding information when we need it. This isn't necessarily the result of being a disorganized person. If someone calls unexpectedly, we might jot down a phone number on any handy piece of paper because it will take too long to open up a digital address book. But what can result is called information fragmentation. Information about a single project may be stored in multiple locations and in many different forms. For example, I find information fragmentation to be evident as I prepare this presentation. I am drawing from articles I've printed out and made notes in, digital articles in which I've highlighted passages, a wiki, several screenshots I made of video images, bookmarked websites, handwritten notes, emails with my fellow presenters, and a journal entry stored on eCollege. Some may argue that I'm disorganized, but I think that combinations such as this are typical for how many people work today. This brings me to another article that talks about PIM behaviors: The Persistence of Behavior and Form in the Organization of Personal Information by Deborah Barrow. She discusses two typical behaviors for managing information in the workplace: filing, putting something in a neatly labeled folder, or piling, putting it into a stack. A finished report may end up filed, but information scraps more frequently end up in a pile of papers. Barrow notes differences in physical versus digital information storage. With physical information, what a document looks like from its color to its size can remind us where to look for it. With digital information, we rely on file names and dates, as well as the kind of software used to create it. But, in Barrow's words, digital environments lack the rich tangibility of the physical world. So, without the same visual cues, Digital information can be difficult to retrieve. The main focus of Barrow's article is to follow up on a study done more than 10 years earlier. In 1993, Barrow studied the PIM behavior of a group of managers. In 2007, she again examined their PIM behavior in order to answer these questions. Which PIM behaviors persist over time? And how has PIM changed with the increasing use of technology? Barrow found many areas where behaviors are consistent despite the passing of 14 years. For example, the managers tended to use a single directory or folder for most of their files. They used file names to indicate the content of the file. They tended to keep old files, but they rarely used them. They sometimes kept things because they had a difficult time deciding whether or not they would be useful in the future. They continued to use the same very personalized ways of managing workflow as they had before. For example, one manager continued to organize all emails and files according to where it came from, since that was his primary way of working, while another organized her work according to whatever speech she was working on. Barrow also found several differences from the earlier study. First is how the personal workspace has expanded because of the World Wide Web. The managers stored information in multiple digital locations through the internet and cloud computing. The second area of difference is the large increase in the number of systems that the managers needed to use, each requiring a separate login and password. Finally, there is the huge rise in the use of emails. For communication, yes, but also for many other purposes. This could be using an inbox as a to-do list or creating a reminder by sending oneself an email. This brings me to the final topic that I'd like to cover, the ways that language, particularly metaphor, can influence PIM systems and behaviors. Robin Cease discusses this issue in an article called Metaphor's Role in the Information Behavior of Humans Interacting with Computers. There are many ways that digital technologies make reference to objects or activities in the physical world. We can think of the desktop, the inbox, cutting and pasting, but these relationships are not inevitable. Take, for example, this image from 1968 of Doug Engelbart using the first computer mouse, which he's holding in his right hand. There's a 5-key control panel under his left hand and a traditional keyboard in the middle. Some, when they first saw this combination of devices for navigating a computer, compared it to a pilot's dashboard. As Cease points out, how different would our perception of the computer be if this idea of the pilot control board had become the predominant personal computer metaphor rather than the desktop? This next slide shows images more mundane, but serves as an example of how our understanding of a metaphor can change over time. On the left is an early Apple trash can icon, a garbage can typically used for kitchen scraps. This evolved into the current icon, which resembles a wastebasket designed for discarded paper, more in keeping with desktop activities. Cease outlines the pros and cons of using metaphors in connection with PIM. Some argue that metaphors can be used as a teaching tool, helping users to draw upon pre-existing knowledge. As Brown put it in the article about teaching we read during week 8, beginning with a task embedded in a familiar activity shows the students the legitimacy of their implicit knowledge. In the context of PIM, starting with something familiar can help people to learn a new technology. Language can help us to learn, but it can also limit what we see as the possibilities for how a system might be used. Cease argues this can affect both users and designers. The article that we read by Talia earlier in the semester about discourses is relevant here. She writes, discourses systematically form the objects of which they speak. Her statement helps to explain why the language of a system is so intertwined with how one understands and navigates it. The last point that I want to make has to do with the politics of language choices. Do language choices serve as an invitation or as a barrier to users? We've talked throughout the semester about many different groups, from inner-city youths to gay males to battered women to academics. The Heath article that we read about the Tracton students explicitly addressed how different groups can use language in different ways. Heath writes, cross-cultural research in child language acquisition has pointed out that the linguistic environment and the the language socialization of children vary across cultures. Uses of questions vary in numerous respects. So, a question that is understandable by one child may make no sense to another child. The same thing holds true for other language uses, including metaphors. What is obvious to one group may be incomprehensible to another. For me, this is a really interesting question, and one that librarians can play a role addressing. How does language choice in the context of PIM empower certain groups or shut them out of the information they might need? I'm looking forward to this week's discussion. Thanks for your interest.